Welcome to Hashtag Trending, the weekend edition. I'm your host, Jim Love. We've heard a lot about the big players in AI over the past few weeks. OpenAI is duking it out with Google. Microsoft is leveraging OpenAI. Zuckerberg and Meta have got Llama. We don't hear as much about Claude from Anthropic, but it's absolutely the best AI for text and writing. And there are a host of other products, many of them that are great, vying for our attention, like Perplexity for search, and there's a list of others. But what we're really not hearing about, for the most part, is the open source world in AI. But it's a huge and growing area. Just one of the players who serves in this arena, Hugging Face, one of the prime repositories for open source projects, has over 50,000 organizations on their platform and over 1 million repositories. So there's a lot of things happening in open source. And I wanted to try and figure that out. And it led to a conversation with a friend of mine named Marcel Gagne. Now, Marcel, you might know him from his book, Cooking with Linux. He's a writer, he's a thinker. You'll see him in a lot of publications. He's also a career sysadmin and IT consultant. And if you've read him in the Linux Journal, Linux Pro Magazine, Ubuntu, Sysadmin, or others, you might have read one of his books. He's written 6 books, Linux System Administration, a User's Guide, and Moving to Linux series books. He's a speaker, promoter, advocate, evangelist. He's also a guitar player. That's for another episode. Welcome, Marcel.
I'm a mediocre guitar player. I just want to get that out of the way. Okay.
Even the best of us. I'm doing a thing on John Prine, and John Prine said the same things. I can't play other people's songs. I can barely play my own. It's okay for all the guitar players out there, and there are many of them in our audience. You play what you play. So
thank you.
We've dispensed with our musical talents. Let's talk about this topic. And you and I started discussing this, and it was fascinating. I'm going to start with OpenAI, because even with the name OpenAI, the company that's become the leader in this arena is, we've got to say, anything but open. It was started as a way of keeping Google from monopolizing the AI marketplace with Elon Musk and Sam Altman. And it's done that admirably, but it's certainly not open source.
No, it's not. But I think we have to consider, when we talk about these sorts of things, that the mission may have changed as time goes on. Like, for instance, at the beginning, it was put together as a nonprofit. And I think that they were probably genuine in their message in terms of what it is they were trying to do, namely work their way toward AGI, but create responsible artificial intelligence tools, and to be careful as much as possible while doing it. If you recall, when the first set of tools were released, and I'm talking about GPT-2 here at the moment, they actually
eons ago, right?
Yeah,
GPT-2, that's
ago.
just like
eons ago. It feels like forever now.
Like almost a year.
It's a little bit more than a year for GPT-2.
A couple. You
get my. When they put it out, they actually said something like, "We'd love to release it out into the public, but quite frankly, we think that this technology is just too dangerous to release widely into the world." Which is funny, actually, when you consider that 2 years after that statement, they came out with ChatGPT, where they opened it up basically to the entire planet, and wound up with 100 million subscribers within, 30 days or something like that. It was crazy.
Yeah. And that was 3, which was astonishing. It blew me away.
Yeah. But originally, like way back when in the GPT-2 stuff, it was actually truly open source. I remember at the time I was writing an article for Linux Journal, and I've been fascinated with the idea of artificial intelligence. I grew up watching Star Trek. What can I say? And
Computer.
Talking to the mouse, right? Anyway, that's from one of the movies, however. Anyhow, I wrote this article, which actually went through all the steps of downloading the model file, installing the various libraries, and creating a fully command line version to run GPT-2 on my Linux system. And that was at the time. So they were genuine at the time. It was real. And I think somewhere along the way, the mission changed, unfortunately, and the name didn't change. And I have thought more than once that they should have done what Mark Zuckerberg did with Facebook. At some point, he decided the metaverse is it. We can talk about that, but He decided
And
that was it, and we're taking the company in a different direction, and he changed the name. And OpenAI probably should have done the same thing.
yeah, I think they're admittedly not very good at naming. And I think even Altman admits to that. He said if he had it all to do over again, he might do it differently. He said the same thing about GPT, which was he consciously named GPT so it didn't seem human. And yet we were both looking at last Monday's demo, and you
Oh,
tell me that the
wow.
aim is not to make a substitute human.
It's it goes beyond that. If you took out I'll tackle that one in like about 2 seconds, but
Okay.
GPT, if you think about it, actually predates the release of ChatGPT. The GPT, Generative Pre-trained Transformer. The transformer architecture, of course, comes out of Google originally, and generative, as in it can put out stuff. Pre-trained, obviously, huge amounts of data, which is where the models come from. So, in a sense, the idea that they use GPT in the name ChatGPT is crazy because it pretty much applies to any generative pre-trained transformer model, of which most of them are, to be perfectly frank. But the demo that you're talking about for 4.0, for ChatGPT 4.0, that was awesome, first of all. Now we're getting into Star Trek territory. That was really great. But the voice that they used, the flirty, friendly, giggly voice that they had and so forth, there's no way that you can tell me that they're not trying to create something that will generate a relationship. And
Oh,
I don't
I
mean
think
like necessarily a romantic relationship, but
no, but absolutely. I think personal relationship of the voice is important. They eliminated that delay, but they gave it tonality. And
ah,
I was saying, I thought Altman was brilliant to have launched on Monday before Google's conference because he stole the stage. And I did a piece on it for the podcast. I had to say, no matter what Google was going to do, no matter how good they had it, they had a problem. The voice was flat compared to
mhm.
the evoking and emotional voice that we heard the day before. And no matter what you did, it wasn't going to compare. I don't know how they've done this, but it's astonishing.
I'm going to direct it just very briefly. I'm going to take a quick side trip. One of the issues, of course, has been the hardware, the compute necessary to make all this stuff happen, to speed things up. I don't have much to say about it at this moment, but I've been following a hardware development called Grok. And I don't mean Grok in terms of
No,
Elon
yeah,
Musk's
the other
Grok.
Grok. Yeah.
Exactly. The other Grok, GROQ, as opposed to GROK, which is
Yeah.
the X offering.
Another
Well,
brilliant branding happening. I have always said, you know what I've said more than anything? Use your damned AI software to help you brand
that's
because you're not doing a great job as human beings. Grok and Grok. Oh, yeah. One's hardware, one's software. Great.
yeah, it makes
Which one's
perfect sense.
which? Yeah. We'll explain this. Sorry, for anybody. So we're not playing insider baseball.
That's right. That's
Elon
right. We're done.
Musk has a software called Grok, GROK,
Correct.
and it's a substitute AI for OpenAI and all that sort of stuff. It's his own little baby. But these guys, Grok, GROQ, they come out of Silicon Valley as well, but they have hardware that is multiples faster. They've claimed 10 times in the story we did on them.
And I experimented with it, and I have to say, like, using the same models on a different platform and using the Grok stuff is damn impressive, I have to admit.
Yeah. So there's a hardware component in there
Mhm.
that helps the OpenAI, but they've also made some real advances in the efficiency of that software. And you know it because they dropped the price of the API and they made all of the things that were available in ChatGPT 4.0 available to the general public. So they're
Yes.
obviously not concerned about swamping their computers. Although I will tell you that night their computers were swamped.
Oh, I know. I was trying to
Yeah.
show it off to people. Of course, and I was foolish because I didn't realize that this new technique where you can interrupt the AI and have the new voices and have that chitter chatter back and forth wasn't yet available. So I was jumping the gun trying to get access to it.
I was lost too, and they said 4.0 was available, and I have the laptop version, all that sort of stuff. And then I realized it wasn't on the chat software, but they
Yeah.
will roll
Yeah.
it out. That's the great thing about this industry is that everything will happen later. But Google's famous for that too. Like, well, most of Google's announcements are by this summer, you'll be able to.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
yes, and that has always driven me crazy, and in fact, I wish Google would get on with it. I know we're diverging from the open
we
source
are. We
thing
got to
for a
move back
moment,
to open source.
but Google's Assistant has been going downhill steadily for months now, and they got rid of the people who were working on that, presumably in anticipation for the turnover to Gemini, and I wish they would get on with it. But anyway, I digress.
Yep. So back to open source.
Yes.
OpenAI is not open. The organizations aren't really organized. That's Donovan. But so OpenAI is not open. Open source is out there. And tell me, let's just get a definition of what open source is, just for the purpose of our conversation, because it means a lot of things to a lot of people.
It does, and there are different organizations devoted to open source, but at its core, it's pretty simple. It's exactly what it sounds like, open source. In other words, the source code necessary to build, to run, to use this particular piece of software is open for anyone to take a look at. What you're allowed to do with it, of course, is wrapped up in the license under which the open source thing is released. And this happens in other fields like Creative Commons, for instance. You can take it and do whatever you want with it. You can take it and do whatever you want with it, but you have to attribute the person you got it from and so on. That exists in the open source community as well. Way back when I first started working in IT, first of all, I worked on Unix systems back then. But way back when, you would be able to go out and get certain pieces of server software to run on your system. If you wanted to run a mail server, for instance, you would download SendMail, you would compile it, you would then install it on your PC, or not on your PC, because obviously we were talking about rather larger computer systems at the time. There were things like Archie and Gopher and names that have long since disappeared from the map. But they were open source in the sense that you could get this stuff, you could modify it for yourself, you could use it for your own purposes and so on. Then at some point, somebody decided we need to license these things in a way that makes sense. And this is where we got things like the most famous, probably of all the open source licenses, which is the GPL, the GNU Public License, which is actually a recursive acronym, as it turns out. Double recursive, yes, because it's the GNU Public License. And GNU, of course, is GNU's not Unix. So
Not
GNU's not
Unix, yeah.
Unix, GNU. Anyway, on and on it goes. It's turtles all the way down, baby.
We'll do a trivia edition later. So
We
so
should
you were
totally do that.
yeah.
Anyway,
So you've
so
gotten
yes.
onto this. Yeah, you've become excited by open source and Unix.
Mhm. And the GPL basically said, look, not only can you take the source code, but you can do whatever you want with it. You can repurpose it for whatever it is that you want to. You can even package it into a product and sell it, okay, for profit.
Yep.
But there's a catch. The catch is that you have to return to the community the changes that you made to create this new product that you're using. So it's very much a share and share like philosophy. And I have to say that this is really what got me excited about open source in the early days. This idea that we were a community of people that had access to this honestly world-changing technology, and it wasn't going to cost us anything to use it. And the communities that built up out of that, I think, got caught up in a kind of magical future that we could see. And it went something like this. We can take all of this technology that historically was available to big businesses and people with millions of dollars at their disposal and large data centers and so forth, and we can make it available to the entire world. We can make it available in countries where the people are poor, they don't have access to the technology, and we can use that basically to raise the standard of living, to bring them into this technological world, to use that classic expression, to level the playing field for the rest of the world. There were all sorts of fascinating projects that came out of open source, including things like the One Laptop Per Child project to
Yep.
not only provide the open source, but provide the hardware to children in disadvantaged regions of the world so that they could become citizens of the global connected world. The idea of open source and what it could do for people in terms of improving the world was heady, frankly. And it's what got me going into this. It's one of the reasons that people would refer to me as a true believer in open source. Because I really do believe in this stuff. It's why I've written so many things about it, why I talk about
It blew me away. I grown up with Unix, Linux, and one of the first big software vendors I worked for in the early days. And then I discovered Sugar CRM, the first open source CRM, and I could download it and we could change it. We did all kinds of innovative things on this and gladly shared them with the community. And that was the thing. There was a community of developers. So I think when you get open source at its best, it is a community. It's not just a bunch of unpaid
Yes.
volunteers. It's a community of people who are doing something they believe in.
Yes. And honestly, they should get a whole heck of a lot more respect for what they're doing, because you have some people in the world who are like the sole administrator, the sole developer for projects on which basically the
Yep.
whole of the internet resides. So open source and the open source technology is not only important in basically building the world that we've got at the moment, but you've got companies that are built entirely on that. Red Hat obviously was a Red
Yeah.
Hat Linux, which was bought by IBM. Amazon is built on Linux and open source software. Google is built on Linux and open source software. These are gigantic world-spanning communities that rely on what the open source community and the open source movement have created.
And believe it or not, a huge chunk of Microsoft.
Yes, like the whole Azure the whole Azure system is actually built on Linux and open source now. And these days, of course, Microsoft, remember when Microsoft started the whole Microsoft loves Linux thing?
Yep. Oh yeah. Yeah.
I remember when
Yeah.
Microsoft was like the Antichrist in the
Oh, I
open
remember
source
that too. Yeah.
community.
Yeah. That was a big deal. So the open source community, is there still that passion, that wonder in what's happening in AI right now in open source?
A couple of months ago, I gave a talk to GTLUG, which is the Greater Toronto Area Linux User Group. Linux user groups exist all over the world. And unfortunately, I have to admit, there's a lot of graying going on, if you will, in those communities. But I think they've been so laser focused on the idea of spreading the word, so to speak, about Linux, particularly desktop Linux, that they are missing an opportunity. And I gave a talk to more or less say, this whole artificial intelligence thing is not going anywhere. And there's huge opportunity for people who are interested in open source and the ideals of open source, for that matter, the philosophy of open source, to get involved in artificial intelligence development and artificial intelligence models, and to basically breathe new life into these groups. Hasn't worked out the way that I would like to see it work. I know that there are people who are excited about this, but I think they're excited about it for different reasons. They're excited about it because I can get this stuff for free, as opposed to I can do good things or I can make good things happen.
Interesting. But if you look at Hugging Face, and I referred to that in my intro,
Mm-hmm.
there's 50,000 companies or
But if you look at
entities on there.
GitHub, if you look at
Yeah.
GitHub is largely a whole bunch of open source projects, but of course it's owned by Microsoft now, right?
Yep.
And I would wager that the vast majority of people who have projects on GitHub, while they may appreciate the fact that what they've made is open source, they're doing it for different reasons. They're doing it because it's a public repository that I can use for free to work and build on my software. In the artificial intelligence world and the AI world, I think that it's important to consider the fact that there are different types of open source when it comes to AI. For instance, Llama was released to the community by Meta. And
Yep.
if you remember, that was an accident. It was leaked. They didn't
Well,
actually.
yeah, I think that's true. And we'll talk about how they leak these models. But like I said, I think it was like getting Donald Trump to debate. Zuckerberg opened his mouth and couldn't go back.
Perhaps couldn't go back, and maybe, if we want to assume that he's a bit more clever than we give him credit for, maybe he figured if he leaked it, all of a sudden a huge amount of attention would suddenly be directed Meta's way, that was directed toward OpenAI and Google. And I may be wrong here.
No, it worked. And open source, and if you talk about commercial open source, there's commercial open source and free or open source. But he's said you can license and use this, if I got it right. You can license and use Meta. we're not going to give you the code, but I'm not sure how that works. Maybe you know that better than I do. But if you're really big, no, you got to pay us.
Yeah, the way that it works is Llama, including Llama 3, is released as modeled weight. So they're open source modeled weight. So you have access to the model. And even then, you have to sign a little agreement with them saying, yeah, I'm not going to use it for nefarious purposes, whatever. I see that as them covering their butts more than anything else.
Yeah.
But so they're releasing the model that way. And after that, somebody can take the model and they can modify it, and they can fine tune it, they can adjust it, they can do a whole host of things with it, but they can't create the model. Meta has not released the tools to create the model in the first place. So that is still hidden. That is still closed.
And for our audience out there, the listeners, those audience, you're not an audience, you're listeners, you're engaged with this. And I keep saying that to myself. The model it's actually relatively not a lot of code in a model,
No,
but the model is relatively simple in terms of the amount of code that goes into it. It's the weighting and the weights that take all that training and the millions and sometimes tens of millions of dollars to achieve. So that's a pretty big entity to be able to have access to.
it is. And with really large models, let's face it, there's a limit to what individuals can do. Even small groups of individuals, like at, let's say, a college or something like this, or your high school computer club or whatever, isn't going to be able to spin up one of these models. However, there are other companies in the game. There's Mistral that's in the game as well. It's
Yep.
a company out of France, which is famously provide an open source AI framework. There's a new one on the block too, which is Apple even has one for that matter, Open ELM.
Really?
Yes, yes. And they released
And
it in
Databricks famously,
that one is fascinating for me because they seem to come out of nowhere, and they have really seemed to shake up the AI world. Part of what they're doing, unlike some of these other ones, is they're not only releasing the model, but they're releasing all of the source code,
yeah.
including the code necessary to generate the model in the first place. So that one is truly open.
We had their senior engineer on when Databricks first released their open source model to the world. And the other amazing thing was they had been able to use, I think they have like 5,000 employees or something. They'd been able to use just their employees to train the model. So they not only issued an open source model, but they had a real rigor around being able to do the training and weighting of a model on a relatively small budget.
And they have done amazing work with it. And of course, the fact that they've opened it up to the community gets a whole bunch of other people who are excited about what they've been able to do to get involved in it as well. But sort of a strange double-edged sword. Like, we're talking at the moment about large language models primarily. And I can understand that because, of course, the biggie, the thing that captured everybody's attention is obviously ChatGPT. And of course, the demonstrations around it. And of course, there's Claude. And I do like the fact that you say Claude instead of Claude. Thank you very much for
I
that.
cannot say Claude. I'm sorry. I refuse. I don't care if somebody tells me that's right. And when it gets a voice, I will correct it. You're Claude. You're not
Good man. I
Claude.
applaud you. I applaud you.
Yeah.
The French Canadian applauds you for that one.
Absolutely.
But there are other things out there as well. One of the reasons that you and I got in touch in the first place is because you did this segment where you were talking to, I don't know if you were talking to them or you were talking about the people behind 11 Labs, and specifically the growing problem of deep fakes, which are starting to show up everywhere. It's like somebody calling up and saying, please don't go to this voting booth because, you need to go next month or something like that. So there's a real danger associated with that. And one of the questions that was put to him is, what do you do about that? What are you going to do about these sorts of things? And he said, we may just have to learn to live with it, or words to that effect. I'm paraphrasing here, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But
No, it was true. That was the thing is in a world where information can be fake all the time, you're going to have to teach people to think critically.
You are, but here's the thing. Large companies, and this is one of the things that, remember I talked about OpenAI at the beginning. It's like, it's got to be responsible. It's too dangerous to release into the world, blah, blah, blah. And somewhere along the way, we changed our mind. I think that one of the things that large companies like that try to remind people is that if you are the one controlling the leading edge development of these models, you can be responsible. You can put checks and balances in place, that sort of thing. Microsoft tried to tell us that for years, despite the fact that you had one of the most virus ridden things in the universe in the early days. Remember Windows 95, stuff like that?
Yep.
But they used to try to say that as, no, we're a big company. We can do things that the open source community can't do and so forth. But so that would be some of the arguments. You can trust us not to be evil because we're very visible and very public, and we will make sure that things are taken care of. But models like 11 Labs, or I'm not going to call it models, well, I couldn't call it a product in this case, like 11 Labs, are actually built on top of certain types of open source software. I remember correctly, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Tortoise TTS is one of the frameworks that is actually being used behind 11 Labs.
Yeah, I can't correct you. I know it's built on open source and a relatively remarkably small organization that grew up overnight because of the
Well,
foundation they
it
could get
almost
from
feels
open
like
source.
overnight, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the fact is, there are open source projects out there to sample and to create stuff. Tortoise is one of them. There's something called AI voice cloning is another project that's available on GitHub. I've downloaded and installed both of those things and played with it on my own computer. The fact is, the stuff truly is out there. Even if you decided tomorrow that these were all really bad ideas and we needed to, create more controls over the technology and access to the technology, the fact of the matter is that stuff is already out there. And Tortoise TTS and voice cloning and stuff like that is one of those things that makes that very clear. You can get access to this technology no matter what. So we've got that. There's another type of deep fake, of course, and it's, of course, creating images, right? Images that look
Yep.
lifelike and look real and so forth. And we've got DALL-E for those sorts of things, and we've got Midjourney and so on. But there's another player in there that's been around for quite a while, which, by the way, is suffering at the moment, and that would be Stability AI, which produced a
Yeah.
product called Stable Diffusion. And Stable Diffusion is fascinating because you can download a number of different clients, and there are a few different ones. One of the ones that I'll recommend if somebody wants to give it a try for themselves is called Easy Diffusion. It's as simple as that. Easy Diffusion. There's an installer
Easy
for Linux.
diffusion?
That's correct. Yes. There's an installer for Linux, Mac, Windows. You can run it on whatever you want. And you can download and install this engine to create images on your own PC without having to subscribe to something. And here's the fun thing. Depending on the image models, the files, the model files that it uses for that, and most of them run between 2 and 4 gigabytes. So they're not monstrous by any stretch of the imagination, which, by the way, throws out this whole notion of all my images are stored in this file. They're not. They can't. You can't store all the images of the world, all the artwork in the world in 2 gigabytes. It's not going to happen. But I digress.
No, another thing for people to understand.
Yeah, I try to correct that one on a regular basis with very limited success. But
I think everybody thinks that they've got that somewhere there's a big server with all of the data in the world sitting in the model.
But they're not.
And that,
If you download one of these things like Easy Diffusion or Automatic 1111, Easy Diffusion is easy. That's one of the reasons I recommend it. If you do that, you realize very quickly that's not the case and that's not possible. Now, there's a site out there called Civitai, Civitai.com, Civitai.com, which,
okay.
you know,
And if you're listening, Marcel, you'll send me a list of these ones you
I
mentioned.
shall.
We'll put them in the show notes because somebody out there frantically going, what was he saying? What's he saying? Yeah.
Quickly, back it up. Civitai, like Hugging Face, is a repository for model files.
Yeah.
Except that it's a repository for model files for Stable Diffusion primarily. Okay. Now, these model files, they tend to be based on the things that Stable Diffusion puts out, like SD and SDXL and SD 1.5 and all the various numbers. But then they are taken and fine-tuned by the community, and there are hundreds, possibly thousands of them. And the files are called checkpoint files. And the checkpoint files have had issues with security in the past. So what you're going to look for is something called safe tensors. And then there are other files called LoRa's. LoRa's are like patch that you put on this model file to direct it one way or the other. Let's say that you want a model file that makes everything into ponies, because
Yep.
by the way, that exists out there. Or you want everything, to look very noir, like a Humphrey Bogart black and white film, or you want everything to look hyper futuristic, something from Blade Runner or whatever. You would get one of these safe tensor files either on its own, or you would get it with a LoRa that would update it so that you tended to weigh it, to push it in one direction versus another. And then at that point, you can see that even though this stuff is out there with DALL-E and they're doing their damnedest to make sure that you don't create NSFW images, not safe for work images, you can do all this stuff for yourself at home. So the idea that we can prevent anyone from doing this is already over and done with, I'm sorry to say.
Okay. Two barriers though. Let's
Yes.
talk about two barriers. One is, and I think you've exploded one of them. You're not taking a ton of data with these models,
No.
but you do need some significant processing. So you do have an issue of whether you can process things fast enough from one of these models, right?
That is true, but let me give you an example. The computer that I'm using to talk to you right now is actually a Lenovo Legion 5, and it has a 6 gigabytes of VRAM NVIDIA card, which is a 1060 Ti, if I remember correctly. So it's not what you'd call a super fast PC. It's got some chops, but it's not like amazing compared to some of the things that people have these days. And I'm able to generate an image using easy diffusion in about 10 seconds, 10, 15 seconds.
Okay.
Yeah, which if you think about going on DALL-E and you enter your prompt, sometimes it can take that long while you're waiting. So it happens relatively quickly. Let's go back to LLMs, large language models for a moment. Do you mind?
No, I don't, not at all.
Okay. In large language models, if you wanted to try this at home, there are a couple of interesting pieces of software that you can take a look at. One of them is called LM Studio. You may have even heard of it. And then there's another one called Jan, which I've become rather fond of lately, JAN.ai. And Jan and LM Studio are both graphical interfaces that let you download models from, oddly enough, Hugging Face, which you mentioned earlier, right?
Yep.
You can download models, so you can download a small version of Llama or a small version of Mistral or a small version, like you can download Gemma from Google if you wanted to give it a try. And you can install all these open source models and run them locally. Even if you don't know what you're doing and you'd like to get a feel for what the open source community is creating, or perhaps more accurately in the case of things like Llama or whatever, what has been released into the open source community, you could do that yourself from home by having something like that. Now, it may run slowly, and the better the GPU that you've got, if you're a gamer and you've got a decent game machine, you will probably find that you get a not bad experience.
Go down to
Laugh
the
there.
basement, take that machine you bought for your kid because it's better than yours, and try that.
Yes, that's a very good idea. What do your kids need that for anyway? Get them a PlayStation.
Yeah. On
Um,
Xbox, Microsoft needs the sales.
Oh, okay. I have a PS5. You and I are on different sides of the
No,
the
it's
arena
just
here.
Microsoft had a big fail on Xbox sales.
I
Again,
know.
we digress.
No.
We'll go
And I was
so
really disappointed that they, oh, never mind. Let's not go there. Let's
Yeah.
not start that.
focus grasshopper. Or let's okay. So we've got you can run these models relatively easy on a better than average computer.
Yeah.
And you can do that using one of these facilities. LLM, I think, is one I've played with. You mentioned
LM
another one.
Studio, Language
Studio.
Model Studio. Yeah.
And that's relatively easy to do, even for somebody who's not really a total technician.
No, it's extremely easy to do. And if you don't understand, there's a lot of things to building open source tools and to modifying open source tools into creating things. Like you might want to learn Python. You might want to learn how to work with PyTorch, which is a library, an AI development library, machine language training library from Meta, or TensorFlow from Google. But you don't need to get into it quite that deeply if you're new to this stuff and you just want to get your hands dirty and get a feel for these things. So install Easy Diffusion, install Jam or LM Studio, download some of these models and see what they can do. And here's the fascinating thing. Although you can download like Vanilla Llama, let's say you download Vanilla Llama to like the 7 billion parameter model, and then
Yeah.
now we get into parameters. But
Yeah.
to get the smaller models, they will easily fit on a
7 billion
PC,
is
like,
tiny, by the way.
I know, but that's because
I
we're
never thought I'd
weights,
say
right?
billion and tiny in the same sentence, but yeah.
Weights. I can even run some of the 13 billion models on my PC here. Okay. The smaller models obviously will run faster, and some are pretty damn impressive, to be honest. And it's a way to get your feet wet. And here's the other thing. Some of these models are completely uncensored. So if you want to get the experience of being able to get your language model to do and say anything, to role play, if that's your thing, you can actually do that locally with one of these models without spending any more money beyond the hardware that you already own. Again, assuming that you've got something like an NVIDIA GPU in there. AMD people, I'm really sorry. While there's stuff out there that works with AMD, it doesn't work as well as with NVIDIA. I'm really sorry he read it.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so you get past that. What about the security issues on this? We did a
Well,
story that said that many of these models have potential malware or at least potential failings built into them.
I agree with you. I do. And in fact, I think I hinted at that with the idea that if you have access to the technology and you have access to things that are truly fully open source, there's nothing stopping you from doing something nefarious with these things in your hands.
Yeah.
And this is where I get back to the guy from 11 Lands. Like, we may just have to learn to deal with it, to understand that this stuff is out there and insulate ourselves with knowledge as opposed to with fear. And I think that's important. Now, I'm going to turn this around. In the early days, particularly in the days when Linux wasn't not run by, but when Linux wasn't largely developed by Microsoft and by IBM and so forth, because those are the biggest contributors in the world today.
Yep.
You had an awful lot of eyeballs looking at this stuff, and Linux tended to be more secure than anything that came out of the proprietary world. And I'm not speaking out of turn here. That was definitely the
Well,
case. And the fact that this stuff is open source, do you remember about a month ago, there was a Microsoft engineer who
the hero.
uncovered a backdoor into one of these open source modules that's used everywhere. Do you remember that?
Yeah. We did a story on him, and this was the perfect hero situation. He saw something that was wrong. He dug into it, and he found something that could have, I'll let you finish the story, but it could have exploded. It could have taken over the internet.
It could have taken down the global internet in many ways. Certainly in terms of there not being any trust whatsoever for electronic transactions in the world. And let's face it, the internet, much some of us would like to think of the good old days, the internet is largely a machine that lets us buy and sell stuff from one part of the world to the other.
Yeah. Yeah. One that was never designed to be secure.
But that is true. That is true. So yes, there is a danger, but by virtue of the fact that the stuff is open source, the opportunity exists for someone to notice that something is wrong and then to do something about it. This is a double-edged sword. There's no question. The person who's sitting there with the large katana in front of you is either trying to kill you with it or trying to stop the person behind you from killing you. Like, they can be either your protector or they can be your attacker. But they've got what it takes in their hands to do damage to either you or the person who's trying to do damage to you. There was a thing a few years ago. Remember, there was a huge worm that affected routers, for instance.
Yep.
And
Yep.
because routers were essentially entirely built on open source software, the companies that had built them basically washed their hands of it. There's no money in supporting these things beyond a certain point. So because it was open source and because people knew how to deal with it, what they did was they used the backdoor that existed to fix the security hole in countless routers around the world. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
remember this very well.
Like, it's a scary thing on one hand because somebody got into your router because of some weakness in the security, but they got into it to fix the weakness was in your
Well, yeah.
security.
and that continues to be an issue to this day. And that talk about another program we could talk about. The attacks on routers either continue to this day. But yeah, but I guess we bring it back to this idea of security. If I've got you right, and I think it is, that when you have an open community, and I think the technical term for it is programmers are bitchy about other people's code. And that's an eternal thing. But somebody harnessed that for good. And that is that everybody's looking for mistakes. And so people find them in unlikely places. This guy, Microsoft, is a hero, but there are hundreds of programmers, and I'm not attacking Microsoft programs. There are just
I know.
lots of good reasons why in a monolithic software organization, people look the other way. And that's why you have zero-day defects.
Well, yeah, if your job was done right, but you needed a little bit of prescience to go with it. I'm going to compare this to something which you may hear coming out of left field here, but the scientific community. All right. True science is built on the concept of falsifiability. Okay. When you put
Mhm.
something out in the scientific community, you also say, here's how you would show that I'm wrong. This is what you need
Yep.
to show that I'm wrong. In short, this is the open source now. Take a look at it
Yep.
and see where I've gone wrong. And the scientific community is perpetually, if it's doing its job right, poking at existing ideas, hypotheses, and so forth to try to come up what's wrong with it. And of course, things that survive eventually become theories, what we call theories. But that's part of the process. We continually look at the stuff, we continually evaluate it. And let's face it, in science, bad things can happen as well. But if we do our job, we wind up with a COVID vaccine that saves millions of lives.
And something that's replicable, right? I mean,
Exactly.
that's the true test. Somebody else can replicate it, and that's faded. So let's back this up to open source now. We've covered a couple of things. I think one myth is it might be inaccessible for people. You've talked about that. The other one is security, is that it may be as secure or better than even closed source models, potentially, if with a lot of eyes on it. That makes sense?
Yeah, well, it makes perfect sense. Absolutely. I agree completely.
Okay. So the third leg of the stool is, why would companies want to use open source software moving forward? Why would they just, oh, I'll just use OpenAI's API and that to be done with it?
Okay, if you've got the hardware, a decent sized hardware, and your needs are not monstrous and you're not trying to serve hundreds of millions of people, maybe it makes perfect financial sense for you to run a local model. Maybe you want to have a model that's trained on your particular data. It has the advantage of the language smarts. In other words, the ability to speak to a person and understand what they're saying in normal language, but it understands your particular business, whether it's a knowledge base that supports how your product works and so forth. Or for that matter, I've got a little AI thingy on my website that knows the articles that I've read, that I've written on my newer website. And you can actually ask it questions about what Marcel meant and what Marcel was saying when he was talking about these things. That would be a good reason for using these sorts of things. And
God, if I could have something that explained why I did things when I wrote, that'd be great.
But that is one of the reasons. Cost is definitely a big reason. Eventually, the cost goes down so low that you might as well go with the commercial product, unless you've got specific reasons to make sure that the information that's represented is represented for you and your company specific.
I, I have this idea, and it's a crazed idea, but I think
It's insane. I agree.
you're getting software right now at less than cost.
Yes.
When you pay $20 a month for OpenAI, or $20 a month for your Microsoft Copilot, or
Mhm.
whatever, $30 for Claude or whatever it is. Hey, now, first of all, that doesn't seem like a lot of money. It's the perfect sort of software as a service type of model. I take this model that says, I read the numbers I had was that the average company in the US spends about $3,500 a year. I can't get a number for Canada, but $3,500 a year in software. Add to that $20 here, $30 here, $20 here. And pretty soon you've added 10 to 20% to the software cost of employers. Now that's today's cost. Microsoft invested $10 billion. I can tell you one thing, they want it back. And processing may get cheaper, but it's never going to go away. So we might actually get to a point where if people start to try to recoup their investment, Altman just said the other day, made all of this stuff available for free. I don't know how he's doing that. Like, how can you make all of this new model available for free? How can you sustain that?
Uh, this gets to that popular term that you hear rolling around these days, the enshittification of software. In other words, you pull people in, you reel them in with this free offering that they get to use and so forth. And you make sure that all their friends are using it as well. So eventually at some point, when you do start exacting a price, even if that price is you as training data or you as the product that they then use to sell to other people, this is the inevitable process for something like this. The advantage, of course, is that you are getting something, you are giving up something, and sometimes it's your privacy. That whole "you have no privacy, get over it" comment was all about. You've given up your privacy for these free services. And if you go into it with a clear mind, that's probably okay. And I understand what you're saying about Microsoft is looking to get its money back, but Google spent a humongous amount of money building this monolithic company that served us web pages and eventually turned into basically something for advertising. And fun fact, do you know what Sergey and Brin and Larry Page, anyway, early on they were asked, somebody said, "This is an amazing search engine that you're building." And I forget who it is that was interviewing them at the time. And they said, "Oh no, we're not building a search engine. We're building an AI." And they understood even back then that information is the currency. And we are the information that feeds back into these models that make them work, that make them possible.
Yeah. And they have to figure out the economics of that. Google's going to go through a big struggle on this as well. I appreciate that they're making all that money from advertising right now. And their advertising side of the business has clamped down on everybody else. I also think that's what slowed down AI development. I think it's the advertising side of the business saying, you're not going anywhere with 91% of our revenue, Jack. And I think that's the war in Google right now. Everybody says they're smart people. They didn't fall apart. But they have a problem with two things. I think one is they're the big kid on the block, so their reputation matters. You can make more mistakes if you're a developing OpenAI company or company. If you're Google, you have a big problem. Like they lost Google Cloud, misplaced a $1.25 billion pension fund. It got deleted. Shouldn't ever happen.
No,
it's headlines around the world.
I did not actually hear about this one.
It's a story we ran a couple days ago.
Okay.
And I'm careful about this stuff. I try to research to make sure it's as true. So I'm saying allegedly did this, but it hit the press in a number of places. So it was sourced in a number of places. But what I'm saying is when you're Google and you do that, it's headline news. If you're Databricks and your model's got a few squirrely things in it and it's open source.
And remember the classic line in all of these open source packages, including Linux, this software is provided free with no warranty.
Yep.
We do not make any promises as to what it can and cannot do. That's up to you.
So the pluses and minuses, if I had, because we have to wrap up, I gotta let you go. But where is the future of open source for AI if you had to put that into 2 minutes?
If I had to put it into 2 minutes, I would say that it's not going anywhere. The very fact that the stuff is out there and the very fact that people are excited about it means that development is going ahead full steam regardless. So by virtue of the fact that all these models that you see out there, Hugging Face, as you were pointing out, all these different products or projects that people are working on. So that's not going anywhere. What I would like to see going forward in my ideal situation is some of that early idealism that says we have been given, as I like to call it, these superpowers. What kind of good can we do with it? I'm the superhero who's just discovered that I can fly. I have to learn to fly first. I have to figure out how not to crash into buildings. And then at some point, I can start figuring out how to save people. And you know what? I'm hoping that with tools like that in everyone's hands, with an excited and engaged open source community, we can actually create, if you'll forgive me, a Star Trek future. A bright future where we reach out into the cosmos and we take humanity to its full potential. Um, how we get there from here to there, I don't know, but I think the fact that the stuff is now in the open community is a good start.
And that's what this discussion is. It's a good start. Marcel, we're going to have you back. I'm going to put an open invitation to the audience. Love this, hate this, tell us. Give us questions. I'm going to get Marcel back. We're going to talk a little bit more about this on a regular basis because I think it's an important piece of component of what's happening in AI. And of course, anybody who follows hashtag trending knows we're big on understanding open source, and we have a passion for that. And that's our show for this week. Our guest has been Marcel Gagne. He's an author, speaker, tech geek, and a Star Trek aficionado, among other things, and I caught the Spider-Man references as well. We hope you'll come back on a regular basis, Marcel.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Take care.
Hashtag Trending goes to air 5 days a week with the latest tech news. We have a weekend interview show, and you're listening to it. It's called the Weekend Edition. But you can join us for the daily news during the week, 5 days a week. Invite a friend. You can find us at Apple, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. That's our weekend show. You have a great long weekend.